Is open for business, a consultant and a public speaker on African business affairs. He now joins us in studio. Victor, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for the lifting of sanctions on Zimbabwe. Do you think those pressing for sanctions against Zimbabwe will listen, and will this be effective?
If they mean to do any good for Zimbabwe?
Yeah.
What took him so long, really? How can you fix a country that is isolated from the rest of the world? Especially if the world is still taking minerals from the same country, especially considering how many Zimbabweans are in diaspora, they're in London, they're in New York. So you can't isolate Zimbabwe and take its skilled professionals. So to me, that's common sense. The minute President Mugabe left, that's when we should have started talking about lifting the sanctions, because we either mean to help Zimbabwe to recover or we don't.
Now, do you think that with the United States and the sanctions on Zimbabwean officials, including President Emmerson Mnangagwa currently, and, certain human rights reforms being needed in Zimbabwe, why would you support the view that this is necessary with regards to the human rights in the country?
Yeah, human rights is a separate issue. And I don't mean people who get killed against because they are protesting should be killed. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying running a country is one thing. Human rights is a different consideration. By that I'm saying to you, you need fuel, you need schools to work, you need police stations to function, you need the health system to operate. And then we can deal with how you are addressing protest. The United States has its own violations of human rights. It's known all over the world. They have done it for years. But we don't impose sanctions against them. We address that issue if they will listen at all. So I don't believe that we should be saying, because we don't agree with how Zimbabwe deals with one issue, although I am at one with the world, that the way they dealt with it is heavy-handed. You shouldn't be doing what we saw happening at the weekend purely because people are justifiably protesting against economic hardships that the government could be expected to fix. But for you to say because of that, we're going to continue with the sanctions is counterproductive, because running a country, as I say, takes a whole lot more than just human rights.
Now, Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa embarked on, state visits to Russia, Kazakhstan, just to name a few countries, and he's cut that, trip short with regards to also going to the WEF in Davos summit, and he's returned home because of the chaos and the conflict that ensued after his announcements of price hikes last week, Saturday. Now, how does this absence affect Zimbabwe's, call for investments into the country? Do you think the finance minister will be able to draw investors back into the country, or would it have been fine for President Mnangagwa to be there at Davos?
African presidents like to be absent from their countries when critical decisions are made. I remember in Kenya when they introduced VAT on fuel, President Kenyatta was not in the country, and we saw them literally tap dancing around the issue, reversing it later on. President Mnangagwa, as the head of state and the head of government and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Zimbabwe, should have been in Zimbabwe when a decision like the fuel price hike by more than 100% was announced, because he knew what was going to happen. I agree that he went to Russia. He might have got Alrosa, world's largest diamond company, to invest in Zimbabwe, but I'm sure he could have done that on another occasion. This was one decision and announcement that required him to be part of it. And what was he doing in Davos anyway? Because if you are running a country and it's going through the crisis it is, people are getting killed, what business do you have parading yourself in Switzerland at some exclusive meeting where you're not going to bring back anything? You're just going to, it's like a PR exercise. What PR do you need if you are getting the worst PR back home?
Do you think he made the right decision in returning home, firstly? And can it get any worse? People have lost their lives. Yeah. People were injured. And, the response thereof and, interventions brought forward. Yeah. What do you think needs to happen in Zimbabwe?
As a military man, I think he's scoring own goals. It's not the first time. When the elections were announced and MDC irresponsibly took to the streets, people were killed. You can't blame that on MDC because the army is not under the control of the MDC. Now here's another case where justifiably Zimbabweans were saying you can't increase the cost of fuel, which is going to affect the cost of everything by more than 100%, and they were protesting. I'm sure they were not threatening to overthrow the country. They might have said, yes, shut down Zimbabwe. They might have even said Mnangagwa must go, but you don't have any justification whatsoever. So as a military man, I think he's going to have to find better ways of dealing with dissent, because this is the honeymoon that's ended. When President Mugabe left, everybody was excited. But now he's having to run the country. And running the country means economic decisions, tough economic decisions sometimes. If he wrote, as he did on his Twitter account, that Zimbabweans are going to have to endure some hardships, he should have been there announcing it on Zimbabwe television, on radio. He should have been going out and addressing the people in person, not tweeting, especially because they had shut down social media.
Now, South Africa has hinted that it will try and help Zimbabwe with the economic troubles that they're facing as a country. Do you think that Pretoria's interventions will help?
If Zimbabwe is in trouble, South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, all the SADC region will be affected. It's in our best interest to help in whatever way we can. Whether South Africa can afford to do it because we have our own leakages in the fiscus and we have all our state capture and the corruption that has drained the fiscus, it's up to the President Ramaphosa and his economics cluster. But in the end, it's our business. It's not a Zimbabwean problem. It's a SADC problem.
Now, how should South Africa assist Zimbabwe with this particular problem?
Part of what the President Ramaphosa is doing is part of the solution, persuading the world that will believe or listen to South Africa. Lift the sanctions because you're not helping anybody. We are SADC. Secondly, they must give SADC a lot more teeth. They mustn't look on while Zimbabwe is killing people in the name of retaining or maintaining law and order. They should be a lot more tough-handed, and they should be imposing own sanctions about this matter. But I'm not saying impose economic sanctions. I'm saying SADC tends to take too long diplomatically talking about this and that instead of intervening a lot more closely. If you're willing to help Zimbabwe stop the sanctions, I'm sure you're willing to intervene and stop the army from taking the tough-handed action that leads to the loss of lives.
The currency in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
There's talk that Zimbabwe is looking to reintroduce its own currency. What's your take on this? Using the US dollar, using the rand, and it hasn't really seemed to help. Everything has escalated.
No, go to the streets of Zimbabwe and ask them what language they speak. They speak the language of the dollar, they speak the language of South African rand, they speak the language of the Botswana pula. So that's the language they understand. A currency, Lulu, is nothing else but the language of trade. So if the people already are trading in dollars, I don't know what's with this nationalistic obsession that we want our own currency. Well, if your own currency is not recognized by your own people, what are you doing forcing it down their throats?
Now, we've seen the Congress of South African Trade Unions International Relations Unit basically coming out and saying that a use of international platforms to condemn violence against Zimbabwean civilians should be used and utilized, especially by the SADC region and by South Africa. What's your take on this? Are we going in the right direction presently? Earlier on, you started off by saying that it took us too long to call for sanctions to be lifted and so on. Just elaborate further on this.
Remember, when I say it took us too long to call for elections to be lifted, trade is the way that Africa is going to work itself out of the crisis it faces. So Zimbabwe in economic isolation is going to run into socio-political instability like we saw. I would imagine South Africa and SADC should have said, what are the critical areas where you need intervention? And I'm sure President Mnangagwa and his Minister of Finance would have said, we're going to run out of fuel. And SADC could have said, is there a way we could help you to not face that crisis? every area where where Zimbabwe is going to run into a crisis that threatens socio-political instability, that's how we should get involved. Not shout from the rooftops and say they are going about this the wrong way. Yes, they shouldn't be killing their own people, because President Mnangagwa needs all Zimbabweans united. But at the same time, when the honeymoon ended of, okay, President Mugabe is out, the real problems of running an economy began, and that's where we should be asking detailed line item questions. What do you need? Are there ways we can help you?
Thank you so much for joining us, and let's leave it there for now. That is Victor Kgomoeswana. He is an author of Africa is Open for Business, consultant and a public speaker on African business affairs, and he was live with us in studio.